A family camping trip. A quiet Father's Day tradition. A 6-year-old boy laughing and playing in the summer sunshine. Nothing about that weekend in June of 1969 suggested that it would become one of the darkest mysteries in the history of America's national parks. But in the rugged expanse of the Great Smoky Mountains, a young boy named Dennis Martin seemed to vanish into thin air, and half a century later, his disappearance remains one of the most haunting cases of all time. Dennis Lloyd Martin was just 6 years old, the younger of 2 boys in a close-knit Tennessee family. He lived in Knoxville with his parents, and every year, the men of the Martin family honored Father's Day with a special camping trip. It was a ritual passed from father to son, and in 1969, Dennis was finally old enough to join in. He was a bright, happy child with a gentle demeanor, shy around strangers, but eager to be part of the family adventure. This year, the group planned to hike into the Smoky Mountains and set up camp at a place called Spence Field, a broad grassy meadow high on the Appalachian Trail. On June 14, 1969, the Martins reached the meadow and set up camp. The atmosphere was light-hearted, filled with the easy rhythms of summer, the smell of pine trees, the sound of insects, the laughter of children echoing through the field. That afternoon, Dennis played with his older brother and 2 other boys. The children decided to pull a prank, a playful ambush, to startle the adults. They would hide in the woods, jump out, and give their fathers a harmless scare. It was the kind of silly plan children come up with on carefree days, and the adults played along, pretending not to notice. The older boys slipped into the trees on one side of the meadow. Dennis, being smaller and younger, ran off in a different direction to hide. A few moments later, the older children burst out from their hiding spot, laughing as their fathers feigned surprise. But Dennis never reappeared. At first, no one panicked. His father, William Martin, assumed Dennis was simply trying to stay hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to jump out. Minutes passed. The laughter faded. William began calling his son's name. When there was no reply, the worry set in. He searched the immediate area, checked behind bushes and trees, then began running along the trail, covering nearly 2 miles to a nearby spot called Russell Field before turning back, shouting the whole way. There was no trace of Dennis. The child had vanished in a matter of minutes. As the family realized something was terribly wrong, Dennis's grandfather set out on foot, hiking nearly 9 miles down the Anthony Creek Trail to reach the ranger station at Cades Cove and report the disappearance. While the family waited, the mountains themselves seemed to turn against them. That evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled in. Sheets of rain pounded the slopes, dropping as much as 3 inches of water in just a few hours. The storm turned streams into torrents, muddied the ground, and likely erased whatever footprints or subtle signs Dennis may have left behind. By dawn the next morning, the search was underway. Park rangers organized quickly, and soon the operation swelled into the largest search in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Over the next weeks, thousands of people joined: rangers, volunteers, rescue squads, Boy Scouts, even Green Berets from Fort Bragg, who specialized in survival and search techniques. Helicopters hovered over the ridges. Bloodhounds were brought in to track scent. The searchers combed through ravines, creeks, caves, and ridgelines, forming grid patterns across miles of wilderness. At its peak, over 1,400 people were scouring the mountainside for a single missing child. But the Smokies are vast and unforgiving. The terrain around Spence Field is steep and rugged, covered in thick underbrush and crisscrossed with streams. Despite the overwhelming manpower, no one could find any sign of Dennis. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a shoe. Not a single belonging. It was as if the boy had evaporated into the mountain air. There were, however, strange and unsettling reports. One search team discovered a few small footprints in the mud near a creek bed. Some were barefoot, others looked like they could have been made by a child's Oxford shoe, the kind Dennis had been wearing. The prints seemed to follow the creek for a while before vanishing. Yet, officials quickly dismissed them, claiming they likely belonged to Boy Scouts involved in the search. Still, some experienced rangers quietly disagreed, believing the tracks may have been genuine. Then came another curious account. On the same afternoon Dennis went missing, a tourist named Harold Key and his family were hiking in a different part of the park, a few miles away. They claimed they heard what they described as a loud, sickening scream. Not long after, they saw a rough-looking man darting through the woods, moving quickly as if trying to avoid being seen. Some reports even said he appeared to be carrying something over his shoulder. To the keys, it was suspicious enough to stick in their memory, and later, when they heard of Dennis's disappearance, they reported it to authorities. But investigators noted the distance. Nearly 5 miles of rugged terrain separated the sighting from Spence Field. Could a man really have carried a child that far in such a short time? Some dismissed the story outright. Others couldn't help but wonder if it was the missing puzzle piece. As the days turned to weeks, the search continued with desperate intensity. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning with infrared equipment. Search dogs covered the trails, though their handlers reported the scent trail simply vanished at one point, as if Dennis had been plucked from the ground. But nothing conclusive emerged. After weeks of searching, the efforts were scaled back. The official operation eventually ended, leaving only the family and a few determined rangers to keep looking. Theories began to form, each more troubling than the last. The most straightforward explanation was accident. Dennis, small and easily disoriented, may have wandered off, fallen into a ravine, or gotten trapped in one of the park's many natural hazards. If that were the case, the storm and flash floods could have swept his body away or hidden any trace. This theory has always remained the most likely in the minds of park officials. Another possibility was an animal attack. Black bears and wild hogs inhabit the Smokies, and a vulnerable child could have fallen prey. But experienced searchers argued that even in such a case, some evidence should have been found: torn clothing, blood, bones, yet there was nothing. The third theory, abduction, is the one that refuses to fade. The sighting of the mysterious man by the Key family haunts the story. Dennis's father himself believed this explanation was possible. If someone had taken Dennis, perhaps using the storm as cover, it could explain why no trace was ever found. Yet no suspect was identified, no leads developed, and no ransom note or demand ever surfaced. In the years since, the case has also become entangled with fringe ideas. Some have tied it to the Missing 411 phenomenon, a collection of unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas that some believe point to hidden dangers or even paranormal forces. Others whisper about government cover-ups or strange military involvement. But these theories rest on speculation, not evidence, and only add to the aura of mystery. For the Martin family, the loss was crushing. They had traveled into the mountains for a joyful weekend together, and they left without their child, with no answers to cling to. Over time, the case faded from headlines, but not from memory. A $5,000 reward was offered, never claimed. Years later, in the mid-1980s, a man illegally hunting ginseng in the park claimed he stumbled upon small skeletal remains in the wilderness. Fearful of prosecution, he kept quiet for years, and by the time investigators searched the spot, there was nothing left to find. Whether that claim was true or not remains unknown. What we do know is this: the disappearance of Dennis Martin led the National Park Service to reconsider how it handled missing person cases. The scale and difficulty of the search revealed flaws in coordination and response, and in the years that followed, new protocols were put in place. But those changes brought no comfort to a grieving family who never saw their son again. Today, more than 50 years later, the mystery still lingers. A boy who slipped away during a game of hide-and-seek, and who was never seen again. No resolution. No closure. Just silence in the mountains where he once played. The story of Dennis Martin remains one of the most haunting unsolved disappearances in American history. A reminder of how quickly a life can vanish, and how vast the wilderness truly is. Where are you watching the video? Comment below, and if you like the video, please subscribe and like the channel. Imagine vanishing into thin air, just meters from your classmates, on a busy trail, in broad daylight. That's exactly what happened to 16-year-old Trenny Lynn Gibson amid the shifting fog of the Smoky Mountains. Trenny wasn't a drifter or an adventurer. She was an ordinary high school junior from Knoxville, Tennessee. She lived at home with her parents, her siblings, and like most teenagers, her world revolved around school, friends, and family. Described by those who knew her as quiet but hard-working, she was saving her money from a part-time job in a mall cafeteria, with hopes of one day pursuing a career in landscape architecture. In other words, she had plans, she had roots, and she had no reason to disappear. On October 8, 1976, Trenny boarded a school bus with nearly 40 of her classmates from Bearden High School. The trip was part of a horticulture class excursion into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Their destination was Clingman's Dome, the highest point in the Smokies and a location known for its dramatic views. But on this particular day, the mountains were cloaked in heavy mist. Clouds rolled through the ridges and visibility dropped to just a few yards in some places. The fog turned the trails into an eerie labyrinth, where shapes seemed to melt into the gray almost instantly. The students arrived at the trailhead around noon. Trenny wore a blouse, jeans, and sweater. At some point, she borrowed a wool-plaid jacket from a fellow student named Robert Simpson, who had been asked by her older brother to look after her on the trip. It was cold, damp, and raw, typical October weather in the Smokies at high elevation. The group set off along the Forney Ridge Trail, which winds away from Clingman's Dome toward Andrews Bald. The hike isn't considered especially dangerous, but the trail cuts through dense vegetation and skirts steep drop-offs. The footing can be slippery, especially in wet weather. The students spread out as they walked, some lingering in groups, others moving more quickly. At one point they reached Andrews Bald, a grassy meadow area that offers sweeping views on clear days. There, many of the teenagers stopped to eat their packed lunches and rest. Witnesses recall Trenny sitting and eating quietly, not far from Robert Simpson. Nothing seemed unusual about her demeanor. After lunch, the group began the trek back. This is where things start to unravel. Trenny, for reasons that remain unclear, began to walk ahead of some of her classmates. She wasn't running, but she moved briskly. Several students later said she passed them on the trail, weaving past without much conversation. She was last clearly seen near a patch of wildflowers, where she bent down, as if to study or perhaps pick something. When those behind her rounded the bend only moments later, she was gone. Think about that for a moment. Dozens of teenagers and adults were spread along the trail, but in a matter of minutes, Trenny simply vanished. The fog was so dense that day that visibility was reduced to almost nothing in certain spots. Anyone who stepped a few feet off the trail could disappear from sight. Still, it's extraordinary that no one saw or heard a thing. By about 3:30 p.m., her classmates realized she hadn't returned to the group. They began calling out her name, searching the brush, and retracing their steps. When there was still no sign of her, the adults on the trip notified park rangers. The search for Trenny began almost immediately. Over the following hours, dozens of people scoured the area, shouting into the mist and checking ravines, creeks, and dense undergrowth. By nightfall, there was still no trace. In the coming days, the search expanded dramatically. Bloodhounds were brought in to follow her scent. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers and professionals combed the terrain on foot. It became one of the most extensive search operations in the history of the park at that time. Yet nothing, no footprints, no clothing, no personal belongings, was found. The forest remained stubbornly silent. The only clue came from the bloodhounds. According to reports, the dogs followed Trenny's scent trail away from the path, down toward a road near Collins Gap. Then, abruptly, the trail ended. To many, this suggested she may have been taken off the mountain in a vehicle. But no one had seen a car, and no one came forward to say they had picked up a young girl that afternoon. The mystery deepened with each passing day. The Smoky Mountains are vast, covering over 500,000 acres of rugged terrain. But the idea that a healthy 16-year-old could vanish so completely, just steps away from dozens of witnesses, was difficult to comprehend. Several theories emerged. The first and most straightforward was accident. Perhaps Trenny slipped off the trail, tumbling into a ravine or crevice hidden by the thick vegetation. The Smokies are filled with treacherous spots where a body could remain concealed for years. Yet the sheer scale of the search makes this less convincing. Hundreds of people walked shoulder to shoulder through the brush. Helicopters scanned from above. And over the decades since, hikers and rangers have covered those same trails countless times. Not a single piece of evidence, no bones, no fabric, no jewelry, has ever surfaced. The second theory, and the one that haunts many people to this day, is abduction. The abrupt end of the scent trail near the road seems to support this. Could someone have been waiting there, perhaps aware of the school trip in advance? Did Trenny willingly approach the road, only to be lured or forced into a car? If so, who would have orchestrated such a thing in a fog-shrouded national park without drawing attention? Some have pointed to the presence of Robert Simpson, the classmate who lent her the jacket, noting that he was one of the last to see her. Over the years, speculation has swirled around whether he knew more than he admitted, though though no evidence has ever tied him to wrongdoing. A third possibility is that Trenny chose to disappear on her own. But this is considered unlikely. She left behind her purse, books, and personal belongings. She had no money, no supplies, and no documented reason to run away. By all accounts, she was a grounded, responsible teenager who had no interest in abandoning her family or future. Another theory is wildlife attack. Black bears and other predators inhabit the Smokies. But attacks are rare, and there was no evidence, no torn clothing, no blood, no disturbed vegetation, to suggest an animal encounter. Searchers also noted that the dogs were able to track her scent to the road, which would not align with an animal dragging her off. So the question remains, what happened to Trenny Lynn Gibson? Was she a victim of chance, slipping into the unforgiving terrain at just the wrong moment, or was she the target of foul play? The timing, the fog, the sheer coincidence of being unseen and unheard by dozens of people. It all adds up to one of the most baffling disappearances in American true crime history. For her family, the decades since have been filled with grief and unanswered questions. Trenny's mother, Hope, never stopped searching for answers. Her siblings grew up with the weight of the mystery hanging over them. The case remains officially unsolved, with no new leads in years. What lingers is not just the absence of evidence, but the eerie quality of the setting. The Smoky Mountains are known for their beauty, but also for their unpredictability. Fog can descend in minutes, cutting visibility to nothing. Trails can twist and double back. Sounds are muffled. In many ways, the landscape itself feels like an accomplice to the mystery. It's as though the mountains swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind but silence and speculation. To this day, not a single piece of concrete evidence has been found. Was Trenny a victim of foul play, or did the mountains themselves swallow her whole? Where are you watching the video? Comment below, and if you like the video, please subscribe and like the channel. Imagine vanishing into thin air on a trail you've walked countless times. That's exactly what happened to Thelma Pauline Melton. It was late September of 1981, and the Great Smoky Mountains were at their peak of early autumn beauty. The air carried a cool edge, the leaves were beginning to show shades of amber and gold, and visitors from across the country filled the winding trails. For those who lived nearby, the Smokies were more than a tourist destination. They were a familiar, even comforting part of everyday life. And for one woman, they were practically a second home. Her name was Thelma Pauline Melton, though everyone knew her as Polly. At 58 years old, she was described as kind, warm-hearted, and deeply rooted in her community. Polly was active in her church, where she often volunteered, and she was a familiar face around the town of Bryson City, North Carolina. She was tall for a woman of her generation, nearly 6 feet, and wore glasses that framed her gentle brown eyes. Friends remembered her auburn hair, her easy laugh, and her comforting presence. Polly and her husband Bob lived in an Airstream trailer near Deep Creek Campground, a popular spot for both locals and tourists. She was in good health for her age, though she had a history of high blood pressure and occasional nausea. None of it seemed serious enough to slow her down. Hiking was one of her greatest joys, and she had walked the trails of Deep Creek countless times, often with her friends Red and Trula, who were her steady hiking companions. On the afternoon of September 25, 1981, the three women set out together for what should have been a simple, familiar walk. It was the kind of day Polly had enjoyed many times before. The trail was well known to her, not rugged, not particularly dangerous. It wound gently through the forest, shaded by tall trees, and followed the sound of water from the nearby creek. She was in good spirits, chatting with her friends, laughing, and enjoying the cool air. For the first part of the hike, Polly seemed to lag behind a little. Her friends teased her playfully about walking too slow. Then, not long after, her pace suddenly changed. Without warning, Polly quickened her stride. She began moving ahead of the group, climbing over a small rise on the trail. To her friends, it seemed like nothing unusual. Perhaps she was just stretching her legs, or maybe she wanted a moment of solitude. They expected to catch up within minutes. But when they rounded the bend themselves, Polly was gone. Not just out of sight, but gone without a trace. At first, they thought she might have turned back toward the campground, but when they returned, Polly wasn't there. Bob, her husband, hadn't seen her. The women began to worry. They retraced their steps, calling her name, scanning the woods, but there was no sign of Polly anywhere. When darkness began to creep over the mountains, their concern turned to alarm. Park rangers were notified, and the search began almost immediately. The Deep Creek Trail was temporarily closed to the public, and a massive effort unfolded. More than 150 people joined the search, including park staff, volunteers, and trained rescuers. Bloodhounds were brought in, and at first, the dogs picked up a faint scent near a fallen tree. But just as quickly as they found it, the trail ended. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded belongings, nothing. It was as if Polly had vanished into thin air. This disappearance was not the kind of mystery that happens in remote wilderness where one wrong step leads to danger. The Deep Creek Trail was considered safe, well-traveled, and tame compared to other areas of the Smokies. Hikers passed through daily. The idea that a woman could walk a few steps ahead of her friends and then be gone forever defied logic. For days, searchers scoured the area. Helicopters flew overhead, rescuers combed through brush, and dogs returned again and again to the same area where Polly had last been seen. Nothing turned up. After a week of effort, the official search was called off. Polly had simply disappeared, and there was no evidence to suggest where she went or what had happened. The mystery deepened as people began to ask questions. What could possibly explain such a sudden and total vanishing? One possibility raised was a medical emergency. Polly did suffer from health issues, and she was known to take medication for her blood pressure. She also had a history of migraines and nausea. Some speculated that perhaps she suffered a stroke or a heart attack on the trail. If that were true, she might have collapsed somewhere out of sight, and searchers somehow missed her. But the sheer size of the search made that unlikely. A body would almost certainly have been found, especially so close to a popular trail. And there were no signs that she had collapsed or struggled. Another theory pointed to the possibility that Polly may have chosen to disappear. The day of her vanishing, she had skipped her usual volunteer shift at the local nutrition center, where she typically spent Friday afternoons serving meals. That, in itself, was unusual for her. Even more curious was the fact that she had used the phone at her church the day before, something she rarely, if ever, did. Some wondered if she had been making arrangements or calls that hinted at a plan. Her minister later told investigators that Polly may have been having an affair, though this was never confirmed. The possibility of a secret relationship added fuel to the idea that she might have left willingly. But if she did, she left behind everything: her identification, her medications, her wallet. She had nothing on her for survival, no way to access money, and no clear explanation for how she could have slipped away without anyone noticing. There's also the unsettling possibility of abduction. While rare on hiking trails, the theory persists. Could someone have been waiting, or perhaps crossed paths with Polly in that brief window when she walked ahead? Yet there were no reports of strangers on the trail, no vehicles out of place, and no witnesses who saw or heard anything suspicious. For an abduction to occur in broad daylight on a popular trail without a sound or struggle, it stretches the imagination, but it can't be ruled out. Another possibility is the wilderness itself. The Smokies are beautiful, but they are vast and unforgiving. It's possible that Polly wandered off the trail for some reason and became disoriented. In the dense forest, even experienced hikers can lose their bearings. If she suffered a fall or became trapped in an area searchers overlooked, nature could have quickly concealed her remains. But again, no evidence was ever discovered, not a scrap of clothing, not a single personal item. Then came a strange twist. Months after her disappearance, a check in Polly's name was cashed in Birmingham, Alabama, where she had family roots. The signature was never verified, and it remains unclear who cashed it. Was it Polly herself, resurfacing briefly under a different life? Or was it someone else entirely, using her name for reasons unknown? The check raised more questions than answers, and investigators could never trace it back to Polly directly. As the years passed, Polly's disappearance became one of the most enduring mysteries of the Smokies. Unlike some cases where clues surface over time, no evidence has ever been found. Theories swirl, but none can be proven. Her family and friends were left with nothing but questions, and the park that she loved so dearly became the setting of a story that still unsettles hikers to this day. What happened to Polly Melton? Was it illness, accident, foul play, or a carefully chosen escape? No one can say for certain. What makes her story so haunting is how ordinary the day seemed, how familiar the trail was, how close her friends had been, How impossible it seems for someone to vanish in such plain sight. To this day, not a single clue has surfaced. It's as if Polly was swallowed by the Smokies themselves. Where are you watching the video? Comment below, and if you like the video, please subscribe and like the channel.